An Ordinary Battalion at War, Episode 4, Crossing the Aisne. So far in this series, we have seen how the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment was set up and learnt a bit about the members of its battalion in Episode 1. We've seen them go over to the Western Front and get involved in their first engagement in Episode 2 at the Battle of Le Cateau. In Episode 3, we followed them during the retreat from Mons, and then where the British Army and its French allies turned to then advance back to the north to fight back against the Germans. In Episode 4, we're going to see them cross the Aisne. As already mentioned, the retreat from Mons has taken place. The French army with its British partners has kind of got back to the extent of the retreat, and units have started to advance further. And we now see the 4th Division, which the 12th Brigade was part of, and the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment was part of the 12th Brigade, are part of the advance northwards and are going to cross the Aisne. Another subunit of the 4th Division, the 11th Brigade, was leading the way, and possibly amongst some of the first troops of the British Army to recross the Aisne in this northward advance. The Germans decided not to hold the river as the obstacle, but to pull back to a plateau to the north, and this plateau kind of forms up as part of the Chemin des Dames, and an area that was going to be fought over throughout the whole of the Great War. We can see in the image on the left, taken from the regimental history, some of the main areas we're going to talk about. Down in the bottom left, the southwest corner, we have Venezil, which is where the story is going to begin. Bouquet-le-Long, we can see that both in the drawing image and on the Google Earth image. Then we can also see Missy-sur-Aisne, and then just to the left of Missy, to the west of Missy, Saint-Marguerite, which is going to be important, but which isn't marked on the Google Maps image. Crossing the Aisne is going to be a difficult task, as we can see from this image, how wide the river is. And therefore the British Army's advance was relying upon capturing and using bridges intact. Now, the bridge that the 2nd Essex were going to cross is in the town of Venezil, as we've seen in that picture. And here is a line drawing taken from the regimental history. Earlier units from the 11th Brigade had captured the bridge intact, though it was damaged, possibly by German demolitions. And on the morning of the advance, the 2nd Essex were brought up and told to wait in the fields beside the bridge. The regimental history tells us that it was raining, and this was probably quite a miserable experience laying around in these fields. And in the line drawing, we can see a bridge marked there. Now, this may be the bridge that was damaged, but it could be a replacement. This image was taken about 5 years ago at the spot, and we can see that the bridge looks very similar to the one in the line drawing, which was done in about 1926. But where this photo was taken from, there are footings of a bridge, which I think is probably the original bridge that the Essex encountered. Whilst waiting at this bridge to cross over and follow the advance to the north, the 2nd Essex found themselves coming under shell fire, and a number of their men were injured, including Lieutenant Reid. Now, Lieutenant Reid, when he returned home to Essex, wrote to the Essex Chronicle and put an article in about his experiences, including during the retreat from Mons. But he also spoke about the grand work of the Essex men. And this is a quote from what he'd written to the Essex Chronicle. 25 miles southeast of Paris, the Essex and other regiments halted for a rest and a much-needed refit, most of the kits having been completely lost. Footnote, you may remember from the previous episode that these kits were deliberately burnt to free up space on the carriages to take wounded or tired men. Reid's account continues. The 11th Brigade had got across the Aisne on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday the 12th Brigade was about to cross, when some casualties occurred as the result of German shrapnel, and Lieutenant Reid was one of the injured. Lieutenant Reid was for 48 hours in a French hospital train composed mostly of trucks which jolted the wounded badly. He arrived at Saint-Nazaire and was immediately brought to England. Asked whether the Essex Regiment was being well looked after, Lieutenant Reid said the food was good when you have time to get it, and the men were becoming splendidly resourceful cooks, making fine vegetable stews from field crops and bully beef. He was glad to be able to say the casualties for the regiment were not so great as was first reported, and also to say the men were as lively as crickets, singing through everything. They have all been promised the pleasure of helping to round up von Kluck, and were cheerfully determined to do it. Lieutenant Reed hoped he would not be too late in getting back, and Lieutenant Reed is to return to the battalion, and he will feature in later episodes. There seems to be a theme, and we will see this a number of times in the story that we have to tell, of soldiers writing to the local papers. And another soldier writing about this same time was Sergeant Miller, and he wrote to the Chelmsford Chronicle. And this is from that Chelmsford Chronicle on the Friday the 9th of October. Among the wounded from the front arriving at Colchester Garrison Hospital on Friday night was Sergeant Miller, 2nd Essex Regiment, who said the Essex Regiment were as cool as cucumbers, and they continually cracked jokes while under fire. When he and the others were attended to a wounded comrade named Crump, a shell burst over their heads, and 2 fragments passed through Miller's clothing without injuring him. Directly he got bowled over like a rabbit with a shot in the ankle. He declared that with regard to rifle shooting, the German infantry was a washout, adding, "What got my rag was that, bad as the aim is, they managed to shoot me. Never mind, I shall be out again by Christmas, I hope." Sergeant Miller referred to the havoc wrought by the German Jack Johnsons, stating that when the shells hit the ground, it made a hole big enough to bury a couple of horses in it. And it seems that he's talking about this period when the 2nd Essex were beside this bridge at Venezel. And Crump is named in that newspaper article. So checking the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, we can see that there is reference here to Ernest Crump dying on the 15th of September, so a day or so later. So maybe he was wounded, as is stated in the newspaper article, and his burial has been lost, and he's marked on the memorial you can see there, as is true for most of the casualties from this period. So the battalion manages to cross the bridge, typically crossing in small parties, and is pushing up north along the road to Bouquet-le-Long. Now, the majority of the battalion do this successfully, but the rearguard of the battalion, which was D Company, somehow gets themselves split away. I think we can imagine those kind of periods of shelling, everyone takes cover, there's no shelling, troops start to move forward. Whatever the case, D Company loses the back end of the rest of the regiment. As they cross, they are directed by an officer, follow the road to Bouquet-le-Long, and as they move a little bit further along the road, they are directed by another officer to say, no, actually your battalion has gone off to the right, has gone off to the east. And so D Company find themselves heading off in a completely different direction from the rest of the battalion. During this period on the Aisne as well, something I should mention just quickly, there's a change in leadership within the battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Gore Anley is required to take over control of 12th Brigade. The reason for that is that Brigadier General Wilson has been required to take over control of the 4th Division, and the reason for that is because the divisional commanders had to move up and so on and so forth. So Lieutenant Colonel Tufnell Major, as he was at the time, Major Tufnell takes over command of the battalion, something that he's going to hold for a number of months. So as we can see here from the regimental history map, that the main part of the battalion is progressing up to Bouquet-le-Long, but as we can see, D Company is headed off on its own little mission, and is heading towards this place called Chirez. Now, luckily, they are kind of intercepted on their way there, because at the time this was still occupied by the Germans. And they move to the north to St. Marguerite, where they meet up with the rest of the battalion. And we can see here that the battalion has kind of moved up, and the regimental history talks about them moving up through a concealed sunken path, taking them up the hillside, up onto the hills to the north overlooking St. Marguerite, and into some of the wooded areas there, where they're holding the front line with the rest of the brigade. One of the people that tells us, gives us a bit of a feel for this time in the battalion's history is Lieutenant A.E. Maitland, and this is an image from the Imperial War Museum collections, and we see Maitland on the right, and this is him in trenches on the Aisne. And this is what he had to say about it. On Monday the 14th, they're still in the same position up on the hills. I returned to my position at dawn and discovered that the Germans had not been turned off the spur, but had built a lot of new trenches in the night facing us. I opened fire at once at any movement, but was at once spotted by the artillery, and I had to change my position shortly after this. My sergeant was shot through the head by a sniper, but I don't think it's a mortal wound. Soon after, I was again found by artillery, who put 2 shells into the bank about 2 yards from me. So sort of footnotes to this is that Maitland was the machine gun officer of the battalion at the time, and so that's why he's talking about opening fire, talking about machine gun fire. But one of the key parts of this is we can see in this image, and we heard there in his account, talking of entrenchments and trenches. And this is where the stereotypical image of the Western Front is starting to form. Because of the artillery fire and machine gun fire, the troops are digging holes to protect themselves in. These are linking up to trenches, and this is going to become the start of that passageway of trenches that leads from Switzerland up to the north coast, to the sort of end of the Western Front, if you like. Now, the battalion was to spend a number of days in this area, and once it got itself established in these frontline trenches, a couple of companies would be in the frontline trench. Another company were being held in a cave system that was to the north of St Marguerite, but not fully up the hills. And then after a few days, there was then the opportunity to have a company in St Marguerite as a town in itself, resting in the houses. And this brings us into some of the stuff that kind of goes on behind the scenes, the work of a quartermaster. And in the regimental history, there's a number of references to how the quartermaster, Freestone, had made good arrangements for their support. Some wine casks were cut in half and filled with hot water to turn them into baths, and some of the accounts say that this was the first bath the soldiers had had since they came out to France, which was on about the 22nd of August. So we're now at the sort of 15th, 16th of September. There's also references to staying in Marguerite and interacting with some of the locals. And in the regimental history is the following account given by an officer, an unnamed officer. While at St Marguerite, wrote an officer, I got my first hot bath since I left England in an old wine cask sawn in half and taken in the presence of about a dozen people. I also enjoyed a bath in that kindly wine cask, said another, but what struck me most in the quartermaster's billet was the way the men treated the wrinkled old dame who owned the house. A typical French peasant, she had lost either her son or grandson in the war, and used to sit weeping in a corner, for her sole supporter had gone and her small property was ruined. Then some Tommy employed by the quartermaster would shyly take the old garnered hand, pat it, and say, "Tea?" The old dame understood, but she probably did not know that a cup always had beside the tea a spoonful of rum in it. The battle has since swept many times backwards and forward over St Marguerite, and one hopes that death was merciful and spared her 4 years of misery. Now, whilst holding this line, there's not a lot that happens. It's a bit of an endurance thing. The companies rotate round, as already described, and there's a bit of a side shift to the east towards Missy-sur-Aisne, but it's pretty much the same position that they hold. But during this period, Major as he was, later to be Lieutenant Colonel, Major Tufnell is wounded. We also have Captain Charles Frederick de Bourgogne, who's in the middle here. He is wounded and actually dies of his wounds. And Lieutenant Vance, who we've met before, is wounded but stays on duty, or stays at duty. Now, there's a number of days of them just enduring this trial by shell fire, small actions of German attacks or advances or patrols coming up against their front line. But this really is the start of that entrenchment of warfare. And the 2nd Essex find themselves holding this ground until the early part of October. And about the 5th of October, rumours start to be going around that they're to be relieved, and relieved by the French army. It actually takes a day or so for this to take effect, but the 2nd Essex find themselves being pulled out of the front line here. And little do they know, but they are heading towards a place that will be famous and infamous for the First World War, and which the battalion is going to be intimately familiar with, and they are heading to Ypres. And that will be the next episode.